way to understand politics in most Western democracies today is that we're in the early stages of a political realignment. Traditional parties of the centre-left are losing votes and basically having a really hard time. At the same time, you've got the rise of populist parties of both the left and the right. On the left, you've got parties like Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, the new party, which still calls itself the Labour Party, but which is actually a new party that's taken over the shell that the former leaders had reduced the Labour Party to being. But more strikingly, you have in pretty much every European country the rise of parties of what is very misleadingly, in my view, called the populist right. Parties like the Front National in France, the Danish People's Party, Austrian Freedom Party, Sweden Democrats, Alternative for Deutschland, maybe UKIP here in the UK. In the United States, of course, you've got Donald Trump, need I say more. Now, what I would argue is that the way to understand this is that we're going through a political realignment. These are things that happen pretty regularly. In the United Kingdom's case, we've had 7 or 8 such realignments since the late 17th, early 18th century, basically. What happens is this: most of the time, politics, however vigorous, however deeply divisive, is done within a sort of agreed and understood framework. Everyone knows what the key issues are that divide people in society. And it's the view you take of those key issues that puts you on one side or the other of the political debate. Every so often, however, though, those old issues become exhausted or new issues arise. And when this happens, you get a short period of about 10 years in which suddenly lots of old alliances break up. People who were on the same side politically suddenly find that they're, bitter opponents. People who had been dire enemies suddenly find themselves appearing on the same ticket and things of that sort. And certain issues just disappear, new ones arise. So, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, one of the great political issues was, did you believe in an established church? And the great dividing line in British politics then was Anglican Tories on the one side, nonconformist and dissenting liberals on the other, with the Irish nationalists shouting in from the outside. And then quite suddenly in 1886 to 1893, you had an abrupt realignment, and Joseph Chamberlain, who'd been the kind of arch radical, suddenly found himself in coalition with Lord Salisbury and the Tories, and we had a new system of politics which lasted until the 1920s when we had another realignment. And my argument is that something like this is what's happening now. This is the political alignment we've had from the 1970s until today. Basically, there are 2 big issues. One is whether or not you favour a free market economy. And so if you are on the right-hand side of that 4-way box, you're basically a pro-free market person. If you're on the left-hand side, you favour state intervention in the economy and an extensive welfare state. If, on the other hand, the other axis is to do with what you might call social liberty. Are you in favour of the government maintaining traditional cultural and social values? Or are you the kind of social liberal who thinks that, for example, you should have a right to gay marriage, that you're pretty hostile to the war on drugs? Now, for the last 30 to 40 years, the basic argument has been between the upper left quadrant, the Social Democrats, and the free market conservatives. So the Social Democrats are socially liberal, but economically interventionist. The free market conservatives, on the other hand, are economically liberal, but culturally conservative. And I'm sure you'll recognise that's the kind of basic division in politics. The other 2 quadrants are rather lonely people. On the one hand, the consistent libertarians, and on the other hand, the consistent authoritarians. And they're a bit homeless, both of them, so they have to decide where to go. What has happened in the last 10, 15 years, since 1997, is that on the one hand, the free market conservatives, particularly since David Cameron became leader in this country, have moved a long way in the direction of social liberalism. The Labour Party, under Blair, moved sharply in the direction of free market economics. So the difference between the 2 became quite blurred, and there was a kind of feeling that the division was exhausted, really, that there was no longer a really meaningful debate. Now, here's what I think is happening now. We're moving to a different kind of alignment. And now the 2 dominant blocks are going to be, I think, the upper right and the bottom left quadrants. So on the one hand, you have, I think, you're seeing an emerging bloc, which hasn't yet appeared, of cosmopolitan liberals. These people are going to be broadly free market, pro-social liberalism, and also globalist, because the new issue that's come to play is the question of whether or not you favour and like cosmopolitanism and globalisation, or whether you resist this and don't like it. Opposing them are the national collectivists. Now, these are parties that are actually very left of centre on economics. They favour a dirigiste economy where the state has a very active role. They're also pro the welfare state, very pro it, but on a national basis rather than the kind of universalist basis that we have now. They're strongly nationalist and they're culturally conservative and authoritarian. This is parties like, for example, Marine Le Pen's Front National. If you look at her economic programme is well to the left of Corbyn. Amongst other things, she's in favour of not only the state taking a very active role in running the economy and controlling what companies do, she also wants to, as she puts it, deprivatise money, by which she means something like the people's QE that Corbyn was playing around with last year, the idea that the state should basically print money to fund a large state investment programme. Same is true of most of the other populist parties. Even though some of them started off as what you might call capitalism in one country parties, they're moving quite rapidly towards a policy that combines a very left-of-centre view on economics with strong cultural conservatism and quite strong, vivid anti-globalisation, anti-immigration, anti-migration position. And it's worth saying something I'll come back to, that kind of bloc, the national collectivists, in pretty much every country in Europe, with a few exceptions, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, there is a party of that kind or a movement of that kind around. On the other hand, their opposition, the cosmopolitan liberals, haven't yet come together. Now, that leaves two other blocs. On the one hand, the radical left, who share the pro-social liberty with important qualifications, I think it's fair to say, and the globalist views of the cosmopolitan liberals, but who are divided from them because they're socialists, basically, who want to see a state-controlled economy. And on the other hand, you have the traditional centre-right national liberals who are nationalist, culturally conservative, but still broadly free market. But my argument is that the real division in politics is going to be between those two blocs there, which I've put in larger fail, the cosmopolitan liberals and the national collectivists. What is driving all this? What is behind this? Well, a common explanation is that this is because of left-behind voters. The argument is that these right-wing collectivists, the national collectivists, are getting support from typically working-class voters in industrial areas or ex-industrial areas that have not done well out of globalisation. And the argument is that, therefore, this is a protest of the left behind. Trouble is, this doesn't actually stack up when you start to dig into the figures more deeply. Take, for example, Brexit, which is commonly explained by being a vote of left-behind voters in places like the North East and the Midlands. When you actually look at people who voted leave and you try to correlate that with things like their economic status, the status of the area they live in, the correlation with that is actually very, very weak. What you do have, however, is extremely strong correlations with attitudes to nationality, social attitudes such as support for the death penalty. If you support the death penalty, the correlation with wanting to vote leave is almost 1.0. It's virtually perfect. And a whole range of other culturally traditionalist and conservative views. So I think that what is really driving this is identity. The crucial thing is the politics of identity. In other words, there's an increasing reaction against the more globalized economy that's grown up since 1990, which is seen as posing a threat to all kinds of traditional identities. Other people are quite relaxed about this, but what is very clear, I think, is that generally speaking, people who do live indeed in the sort of more run-down ex-industrial areas are the ones who feel this identity threat most keenly, whereas the more successful middle-class voters who live in the major metropolitan areas, far from seeing this as a threat, actually welcome it. This is where the big divide comes from. And what's also going on is something I've spoken about in another forum, a metapolitical shift. What I mean by that is a change outside politics in very basic attitudes, outlooks, emotional instincts, if you like.
And what you can see in many European countries is the growth of a feeling that male identity is under threat, that essentially the world is becoming dominated by women, it is becoming feminized, and there's a strong cultural reaction against that.
Also, if you look at things like popular fiction, you'll see signs that, for example, there's a growing feeling in many parts of the world that the only honest and honourable institution left is the military, which is a very dangerous attitude to have, but it seems to be increasingly widespread. So, how does this apply in the UK? Now, the vote to leave in the referendum is, I think, a consequence of this realignment rather than a cause of it. But what it's going to do, the aftermath of it, I think, is to significantly accelerate the realignment process that I was talking about. Now, recently, Opinion, in worked with The Guardian, did a significant survey of British voters in which they asked a whole series of questions, not about politics, but about a whole range of questions and issues. Some of them political, some of them not. And they came up with the division of Britain into a number of tribes. Now, their tribes are the ones on the left there. This is how I would actually categorize them. I would lump some of them together. The first block is what they call common sense, and what I would call old conservative. These are basically slightly older, retired or slightly older people, middle class, professional, but generally successful, not entirely so, not in the top range of incomes, but above average, typically living in the countryside, sometimes seaside towns, older, well-established suburbs. They are overwhelmingly pro-conservative, but they're culturally conservative. They're very opposed to immigration. They were very strongly in favour of Brexit. The next block is two tribes that the Opinion group identified: Our Britain and Community Tribe. These are basically old Labour. These are traditional working class white Labour voters in places like the North East, the Midlands, pretty much everywhere apart from Scotland, interestingly, where they've switched over to the SNP. The difference between Our Britain and Community Tribe is that Community Tribe is, well, both of those blocks of people are very left-wing on economics. They favour renationalising the railways. They favour taking the utilities into public ownership. They're very strongly in favour of higher levels of tax to redistribute income from the rich to the less well-off. They're strongly in favour of the welfare state, but not the welfare state we have. They're also, however, very anti-immigration, very nationalistic, conventionally patriotic, and they can't stand Jeremy Corbyn. The difference between the Our Britain and Community Tribe is that for the Community Tribe, which makes up 5% as compared to the Our Britain's 20%, the left-wing economics trumps the cultural conservatism, whereas for the other thing, it's the cultural conservatism that ultimately counts for more. According to recent surveys, more than half of those who voted Leave, Labour voters who voted Leave, have now abandoned the Labour Party, which I suspect is going to bring about a major realignment in itself. The next two groups are basically free market liberals. The Opinion survey calls them Free Liberals and New Britain. New Britain is basically Blairites, Free Liberals is basically libertarians. I think there's very little difference between the two, actually, and they make 15%. Then you have progressives, this is the kind of Polly Toynbee tribe, egalitarian liberals, if you will. And then finally, you have democratic socialist radical left, which is Greens plus the Corbyn Labour Party. Now, that last group are typically metropolitan, professional, above average income, typically found in the southeast, Greater London, major metropolitan areas. So there's quite an interesting divide in the country that way. The question is, how is this going to work out? Because, as we'll see in a moment, there's a couple of key questions here. If the Conservative Party from that looks to be in an interesting and rather difficult position, on the one hand, it currently gets the votes of both the old Conservatives and a significant chunk of the free market liberals. However, there's a huge opportunity for them, which is to mop up a large part of that Our Britain old Labour tribe. To do this, however, they will have to move quite clearly in a populist national collectivist direction. They'll have to move to the left on economics, maybe make some symbolic thing like renationalising the railways, and they will have to also become much more explicitly anti-immigration, sceptical about globalisation. If they do that, they will lose the support of the free market liberals, who will drift away to who knows what, some other party probably. On the other hand, they might try to hang on to the free market liberals. The longer they try doing that, the more likely it is that UKIP or some party like it will mop up that old Labour and become a populist nationalist party of the continental kind. Here's another slight way of seeing things. Leaving aside Scotland for the moment, I'll say more about that in a minute, you can think of England and Wales as being divided up into three countries: Brexitshire, Leavestan, and Romania. And so Brexitshire is basically large parts of the southeast of England, most of rural England. It's basically the part of England that's inhabited by the old Conservative I mentioned earlier. Leavestan is basically the Our Britain. It's the decayed industrial areas. And Romania is the rest of the country, but Romania is divided into three quite distinct blocks: radical left, progressive, and free liberals. So the interesting question is, how is that going to work out? What are some of the issues that will happen that I think are going to determine what form this alignment takes? Three things. The first is, what is going to happen to the centre-right? Is the Conservative Party going to continue its current position, or is it, as I suspect it will do, going to shift quite sharply in a more national populist direction. If it does that, it may well deny electoral space for a party of that kind to emerge. Certain things tell me this might be the way Theresa May's instincts lean her. Not least the fact that her key guru, Nick Timothy, is a huge fan of Joseph Chamberlain, who is perhaps the originator of that style of politics all those years ago. On the other hand, it's quite possible that if the Conservative Party doesn't go that way and remains pretty open to the free market liberals, that we will see the emergence of an effective populist party of the kind we've seen on the continent. The reason being that the votes of Leavestan are geographically quite concentrated, which under our electoral system means that you can actually make a significant electoral breakthrough. UKIP's big problem at the last election was that its vote was very evenly spread. But if its vote starts to become concentrated in Leavestan, it could win 90 to 100 seats quite easily. Second big question is, will the Liberals get their act together? As I said earlier, one of the things you can see around Europe is that the National Populist Party is clearly there already and is pretty coherent and well organised, whereas the cosmopolitan Liberals are divided and all over the place, mainly because they can't agree about economics. So one of the interesting questions is, will the progressive Liberals and the free market Liberals find some way of cooperating together in a broadly liberal, internationalist, broadly free market, but probably more egalitarian party? That would be the kind of compromise that might work. Meanwhile, the radical left are utterly stuffed. I mean, I must say, there's a kind of mass delusion going on at the moment amongst the rank and file members of the Labour Party, who are constantly putting stuff on comment lines about how you don't understand, we're going to sweep the country. I was at a meeting and there were 400 really excited people there. Which, they don't seem to realise that's not how you win elections. And finally, what about the EU? One of the things I would argue is that just as the debate about what sort of state church we should have suddenly became a matter of no interest whatever to anybody in the 1920s, I think that within 4 to 5 years, the whole European issue will not be an issue at all in British politics. We will wonder why on earth we got so excited about it. That's partly because I think there will be a negotiation of some kind which will end up in a conclusive Brexit, but it's also because it's not clear to me that the EU is going to survive, and I don't think it will survive in its present shape. In the next 4 to 5 years, either they're going to do what they should have done at the time of the Maastricht Treaty and create the common governance institutions which they need to support the euro, in which case they will basically create a European state which no British party of any colour is going to want to join, or, which I fear at the moment is a more likely prospect, something will happen, probably maybe Marine Le Pen winning the presidential election next spring, which I think is well within the bounds of possibility, particularly if Nicolas Sarkozy is her opponent, and which will then lead to basically the collapse of the EU in its current form, given what her policies are and what she said she'll do. So that basically is the kind of analysis I have about where we're going. And I think at the moment we're in the early stages of this realignment, but it will be completed within 5 to 6 years because it's been accelerated significantly, I think, by the Brexit referendum in this country.